Okay, I think we're live. I'm just gonna do a quick confirmation of that. Okay, sorry. All right, great. We are indeed live. So first of all, I want to, oops, I'm getting a little echo. Let me just switch that, fix that. So I want to thank everyone here and welcome everyone. I want to welcome everyone who's watching this live. We're streaming on Facebook Live right now, and then tomorrow or the next day, this panel event will also be, you'll be able to view it on YouTube as well. So I want to welcome everyone who's tuning in live and everyone who watches it in subsequent days and weeks. And I especially want to welcome our outstanding panel tonight, who I'll introduce shortly. First, let me just introduce myself. I'm Louis Slofsky. I'm one of the editors and co-founders of Political Animal Press, which is a press dedicated to real philosophy and serious political thought. Obviously, our meeting tonight, this panel discussion tonight, is on Alex Priou's new book, Musings on Plato's Symposium. You can see part of the cover for that behind me. Oh, there. Everyone's putting up the book. The wine-soaked image behind me is also from the cover. I want to say, the panel will, I'm sure the discussion will focus in many ways on the substance of the book and to some extent on the type of book that it is. I want to say something quickly about that latter, what type of book it is from the perspective of the publisher. And first, I simply want to say that this book was a pleasure to work on. I had the good luck of making a friend in the author over the course of working on it, and that doesn't always happen, but it isn't entirely surprising in this case, as Alex and I had a number of friends in common, and I'll just mention our good friend, the remarkable Plato scholar Travis Mulroy, David Barr, with whom Alex runs a podcast called The New Thinkery, also with Greg McBrayer, and our friends Paul D. Duke and Andy Kowalchuk, with whom Alex teaches. Second, I want to say that from the outset of this project, we regarded this book as a kind of challenge. And we mean that, by which I mean a challenge to other thinkers and other authors. It's not at all uncommon here and now to hear complaints about the way one must write in order to publish about philosophic and political subjects in today's academy. The demands of the system itself, the ideological commitments of parts of the system, the technical jargon, and the requirement to make certain kinds of arguments or engage with certain kinds of irrelevant scholarship harm the cause of insight and the cause of communication. If one looks at any number of great examples of writing on such subjects from the past, they are almost unrecognizable by comparison to current offerings. And especially as our world sadly darkens, it seems there is a need to find modes and orders by which real education can be served, both for the sake of better political understanding and for the sake of the philosophic life, for friends and potential friends of that way of life. But how many people are willing and able to write books that attempt to speak differently? At least one such person is our author tonight, Alex Priou. He's written a very good book indeed. One on one of the most important works by one of the very greatest philosophers, that is Plato and his Symposium, and on the subject of love, which is so fundamental in importance to human life. And Alex has done so by writing a book that is philosophic without being scholarly. In my view, that takes some real courage. And I think we ought to admire that in Mr. Priou. Again, it is a challenge to other authors and thinkers. If you think you can write good books that are different than what is out there, go write them. There are people who want to publish and read them. And perhaps it is so that times of crisis are also in some measure times of opportunity. It seems to me that this is a course by which such opportunity might be well exploited. So with that, to our excellent panel, I'm just going to introduce everyone. Dr. Alex Priou is teaching assistant professor in the Herbst Program for Engineering, Ethics, and Society at the University of Colorado Boulder, and faculty fellow at the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization. He is again the author of Musings on Plato's Symposium, the subject of our conversation tonight. Dr. Jeff Black is a tutor at St. John's College, Annapolis. Dr. David Levy is a tutor at St. John's College, Santa Fe. And Dr. Michael McShane is Director of Public Humanities at the Dallas Institute of Humanities and Culture. So I want to thank all of you for being here. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to the author of Musings on Plato's Symposium, Alex Priou, for some opening remarks. And I will slip away as those remarks are made and the conversation ensues. Thanks, everyone. Alex.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you for publishing the book and also for having the courage to go on Zoom with Alcibiades bits and pieces over your shoulder. Also, before we get started, I wanted to give Michael an opportunity to say a quick word about the Dallas Institute, because I think some of the people watching might be interested.
Thanks, Alex. Before I do that, I would also just like to say how impressed I am with Political Animal Press. And, this is what I enjoy seeing is lots of people complain about it, but very few people, roll up their sleeves and do something. So, hurrah, may there be more like you. With regard to the Dallas Institute, we do lots of things. And one thing I would just like to put in a plug for is that every summer we run a thing called the Sue Rose Summer Institute for Teachers. It's for K through 12 teachers. Our goal is to honor teachers by helping them to get in touch again, to renew their contact with the thing that perhaps got them involved in this teaching in the first place, which is the love of learning. So we read classic literature every summer for 3 weeks. If you're interested to know more about this, please contact me, Michael McShane, at mcshane@dallasinstitute.org. Thank you, Al.
Thank you, Michael. So I'll say, just as by way of a sort of brief introduction, that first of all, Louis, your praise was too high, and in the middle of it, I got a text message from David saying I don't deserve this much praise. It just shows that I shouldn't have friends like that. David treats our mutual friend Greg far better. For anybody who wants an image of that kind of friendship, just turn to page 29 of the book. But to the present point, I'll just say that this kind of event, I'm really grateful for it, because when writing a book, there's always a strange sort of publicity about it. And when writing a scholarly book in particular about Plato as well, there's this strange tension between, or sort of opposition between the way in which one is compelled to write and the way in which one discusses it with your friends. And so when I was teaching a seminar last fall on the Symposium, because I was asked to write something on Strauss in the Symposium, and I found myself writing, the dialogue came together, I found myself writing these snippets, and I thought, these more accurately reflect the way I read Plato, and I like to discuss Plato. And so more than anything, I wrote this book just because I was enjoying writing these little sort of aphorisms or vignettes, but also because I I felt like it would be a nice invitation to conversation, to people who might want this sort of thing, hear about it, and enjoy talking about it. And one of the most pleasant things about writing this book has been engaging in conversation with others. And so the symposium is in a way about philosophy and poetry and why a philosopher would write, or why one writes at all. And in thinking about writing and what exactly I'm trying to do, and sort of just capturing a little bit of why I enjoy this book, ended up giving me a sort of greater appreciation of the sort of invitation and provocation to conversation that a book can be. And so, whereas, I wrote a book on the Parmenides, I felt like I was trying to answer all the right questions. Here, I felt like I was just trying to ask the right questions and put those before people. And so I'm hoping to get some good questions and ask some good questions and have a good conversation today. So I'll leave it at that. We don't have an order of things, so I don't know, maybe one of you could say something.
Yeah, maybe I'd be happy to take a first stab at this. So thanks, Alex, for writing this book. I really enjoyed reading it. It made me think more about the symposium and more about it than I have in a long time, especially about Socrates' speech. So I appreciated it certainly for that reason. And I thought maybe because a lot of the questions that we shared beforehand had to do with Socrates, we could start by trying to talk a little bit about Socrates' eroticism. One of the observations that you make and that you return to from time to time is perhaps surprising coldness in Socrates' relationship to beauty, a coldness that Alcibiades characterizes, and that you mentioned early on as Socrates' moderation. But we've got this against the backdrop of the possibility that eros is a cosmic principle, is something that extends throughout nature. So maybe just a place to start would be to try to characterize the respect in which Socrates is erotic, if in any respect.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe the core question of the symposium, where philosophy is presented as a form of eros, which on a certain level makes some sense, but maybe not on the most fundamental level, which is, I guess, what you're getting at with the coldness. I mean, the young Socrates in Socrates' speech has a kind of chilly reception of the beautiful. It's not evident to him what it really gives you. Whereas when it comes to the good or the good things, he's sort of quick. Yeah, that would make me happy to have good things, obviously, right? So there's and so evidently there's some disjunct between the beautiful and the good / happiness for him, which Diotima tries to counter and argue against, and which, again, I argue Socrates doesn't meet with the warmest reception. Not to say that he's completely indifferent to its sort of importance in philosophy, and obviously what he does with Alcibiades and what he does with Agathon involves a kind of beautification of philosophy, associating the philosophic life with certain promises that might be extrinsic to it, but it might be a sort of healthy confusion that sort of raises one up toward the activity, allows you to see that it's the best avenue, or maybe the only avenue to the satisfaction, and perhaps that charm needs to be broken, but the charm is broken not with philosophy, but with that other wish or sort of hope that's involved. And so there is a kind of chilliness, you could say. It's not as chilly, I think, as Agathon's view of the world, which is exceedingly, maybe excessively nihilistic. But it is certainly not as optimistic as we might want, and certainly not as optimistic as a sort of first reading of Socrates' speech would suggest.
Do you like the formulation that Socrates feels eros or experiences eros for the good? There was something you said early on that suggested that might be a problematic or a transitional formulation, but well, yeah, maybe could we just say a little bit more about what's problematic about that statement?
Yeah, it's difficult because and the Republic is somewhat helpful here, but one thing I was struck by when I was teaching for the last time was tracing exactly where the good comes up and the beautiful comes up. Whereas initially it's about the good things. And I worry that turning the good things into an ADOS or an idea, right, as the good, giving it that sort of unity and absolute quality involves some over association with the beautiful, if that makes sense. That making it a first principle, as it is in the Republic and as seems to be suggested, though not really in a more subtle way in the Symposium, that involves abstracting from and losing a sense of the concrete goods of actual life, real goods that you experience and enjoy. I'm not sure if that's Eros, I guess is my point, though it might involve an element of Eros mediated or something like that.
Right. So something like saying that Eros is a strong drive towards whatever your goal might happen to be, this sort of move that Diotima tries to make when she generalizes it and says some people have Eros for the beautiful, but others have Eros for other things. That is a kind of misrepresentation of Eros, which really is closely tied to the beautiful, right? And to the hope, maybe for immortality that the beautiful brings with it.
Yeah, I think Eros, one way to make this a bit less abstract and more tangible is to talk about how when we think about what would make us happy, what would be a good life, we tend to like to draw a picture, right, of that life and come up with a vision, right? I don't know, a vision board or manifest it or something like that. And there's something very, I think, important about that process, right? You have to think about where your life is going to be, what you'd like to do. But when you think about actual good things in life, it's often they come despite that vision, right? And so we do sort of fall in love with a version of ourselves, a sort of idealized version of our life that involves certain ends being attained. But I think when you sort of actually step back and live life, it's often despite those ends, and we often find that the even achieving those goals is not as enjoyable as sort of working towards them and thinking about them and all those sorts of things. And that would be one sort of problem. The way this shows up in the Symposium is in a way the lovers of Socrates, who tend to idealize him and turn him into a kind of model. It's a version of what you see. It's a sort of dramatic version of what you see in the argument, also in the action of the Republic, where you get these pure models of heroes and gods, and these are somehow to be emulated. And Glaucon seeks to emulate them, and sort of ends up LARPing as a guardian or something like that. That sort of it's a version of falling in love with another person, but one in which you model yourself. So this is Aristodemus, effectively, as he idealized Socrates, falls in love, tries to model him, falls short, and thereby forgets the actual goods that he might be able to have, because he's trying too hard to sort of. And so I think it's important to sort of craft those visions, but to do so soberly, and then to reassess them soberly, and always to have one eye on your actual life. And that seems a little too realistic and concrete to be the subject of Eros, because no one good thing that you experience will be the be all end all of your life. A good meal, good conversation, an interesting thought, those are things that come and go, and if you miss them, you might have it another time. It's not this sort of decisive be all end all moment or sort of event in your life that seems more characteristic of Eros, right? Where flesh of my flesh, bone of my bones, this one at last is mine, right? That concrete feeling of fulfillment in another, whether that other be a person, a romantic beloved, or a vision of yourself.
That last comment made me wonder about something. Well, really, the whole thrust of your comments limiting Eros and separating it from all desire for the good. led me to just think about the fact you observe it somehow in your book that there's no eros for anything other than other human beings in the ladder of love.
It's subordinated to the lower levels. That's right. It seems to drop out, which suggests something's happening to it. Right?
Well, but even in the lower levels, there's not eros for the laws and practices.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder if Plato's not saying in the strict sense, there's really only love of other human beings.
It might be the case. I mean, it's difficult because the further this gets at the self-affirming versus self-negating parts of eros. And I wonder whether and so, you know, the symposium is in many ways related to the Phaedo, right? Symposium goes all night, Phaedo all day. Symposium ends with a rooster. The Phaedo ends with a rooster as well. One's about love, one's about death. And in fact, you get a formula for philosophy in the Phaedo as eros is dying and being dead. Philosophy is dying and being dead, but the way this is explained is as an eros for thoughtfulness or phronesis. And there it's said that they want to love, they want to see and be with it, which is the exact formula used from the Symposium. So my way of thinking about this is that whereas there's a sort of self-negating asceticism as characteristic of the Phaedo, there's self-affirming reproduction that's characteristic of the Symposium, which is most obvious reproduction of yourself in sexual reproduction, love of another person. And so that would be, you could say, the paradigm for eros, and maybe that's why it's most associated with this lower level. And certainly as you go up these levels, I think there's a peculiar thing that happens when when Diotima applies eros of another reproduction to not obviously reproductive things like the giving of laws and practices or writing of you know, epic poetry or invention, where it seems like the offspring there is somehow accommodating that for which it is an offspring, right? Or another way to put it is that the laws and practices need to fit the pre-existing people. And there it seems to imply not a self-affirmation, but a self-negation. And so perhaps eros drops out because at that point, eros is now being somehow diluted or somehow appropriated to this self-negating sort of, it's a self-affirmation by way of the other that involves, I think, too much of a negation of yourself. Does that make sense? I mean, obviously in reproduction, there's an accommodation of somebody else, right? It's reproduction with another person. But it seems like looking at law-giving and poetry, writing of poetry as self-affirmation, misses something crucial in that process. I'm not sure if that works as an answer, but.
Well, and one thing I take from what you're saying that I think is clearly missing is one doesn't get the good for oneself for all time from any of those forms of reproduction.
I don't think so, no. This comes up really clearly in, I discussed this in a section called Always, but the way ae is used, that's the Greek word for always, is really ambiguous. Socrates accepts that eros is of the good being one's own, always, ae. But when Diotima then takes it and makes it about a desire for immortality, he resists. And the only way to make sense of this, as far as I can make sense of it, is to say that ae there does not mean always, but it means all the time, which is another meaning, like to continue. Now, it's very ambitious to want to have the good all the time, but it's not necessarily all the time for the complete duration of an event being one's life, right? To want that all the time might be ambitious, but it might be humanly sort of sensible to always be seeking the good and trying to achieve it through one's whole life. Whether that means to try to attain immortality at great sacrifice in the present for an uncertain immortality, and even a questionable whether it's even you that's being pursued. There's so many questions here. I think that's where the immortality question is something that does not necessarily appeal to even the young Socrates. Say that
Well,
again.
So that passage where Socrates goes silent, she's also turned to this confusing language about begetting and the beautiful. Right. So that there's another reason he could resist it, but there's something in the way you're phrasing it that strikes me, and it's a somewhat different way of looking at it, where it seems like you're thinking about what would be the best way for humans to be through life, and this sacrificing definite goods for hypothetical immortality doesn't look like such a great idea. But couldn't you look at the passage as just saying this is fundamentally what humans want?
This being
The good for oneself, always in the strict sense.
it might be, and I think the question you're sort of edging up against is whether that wish can be, or that hope can ever be sort of eliminated, right?
Well, so that be part. So that's one key question. Can that wish ever be eliminated? But another one is the existence of that wish crucial for understanding everything said about Eros afterwards?
Yeah, I think so to a certain degree. I mean, my general sense of where Socrates comes out in this is that and so when he opens his speech and says, I'm going to sort of put things out of order, effectively, is what he says. I think what you're meant to do is to plug in the first part of the speech afterwards and ask, okay, they've taken this, he rejects the beautiful in the favor of the good. They have this exposition of the good. Then the good becomes, you want to have it be yours forever or always, however that's supposed to be meant. And then that says, well, then you need to beget the beautiful, right? That's the next move. And then it never returns to the good. And so you have to kind of put it back together. And I think one can justify some commitment to reproduction or production, as it were, depending on what part of the latter you're thinking about, because I'm not sure that the higher level is reproduction, but you can have some sort of qualified commitment to it in light of this other longing. I'm not sure, to give an example, that when Plato writes, he does so out of a wish for immortality. I think he writes in such a way as to prepare for the fact that the whole history of philosophy might be footnotes for him, but that it serves multivalent purposes. One being, perhaps this will get into the hands of somebody down the line. Perhaps this will be of service to the academy. Perhaps this will be of service to my friends, right? There's tiers of that. Whether that wish, perhaps this will be 2,500 years of footnotes. Perhaps whether that wish, if he had that wish, was a wish for immortality, I don't know. I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer, but it strikes me that it's doing multiple things at once. I'm not sure if that helps address that issue or not, but
Well, it could, and I certainly don't think Plato thought in any serious way he would be immortal. But I guess another thing I'm wondering about is, so I think maybe more than you, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, okay, so we start out with humans want the good for themselves for all time, or you could call that happiness in Aristotle's sense, a good to which no good could be added. And then we get this business about begetting in the beautiful, and it's very unclear what that has to do with anything. And I had this hunch there are just mysteries put there to try to make you put it together. And why was the beautiful crucial? Right. So some of us turn toward reproductive immortality according to the official teaching, but she insists humans can only do that with the beautiful. She doesn't insist that with animals, and you could say fitness, and evolutionarily, animals do have some concern about fitness, but that can't be identified with the beautiful.
yeah, well, it's difficult with animals and Darwinism. I'm thinking of when I was at St. John's, Jason Tipton gave an excellent paper on Darwinism where he pointed certain animals go extinct because certain traits are deemed beautiful, but they're actually not advantageous. Saber-toothed tigers having big tusks. Oh, what a, and so there's some kind of, now I don't know what's going through a female saber-toothed tiger's head. I'm sure it's a mystery to male saber-toothed tigers, even at the time. But there is some evidence within evolutionary theory for beautiful but not advantageous traits being selected, perhaps as symbols of fitness, but not actual markers of fitness. I don't know if that affects your argument, but maybe
Well, just the crucial thing is, for some reason, for humans, beautiful is essential. No one says beautiful is essential for animals, even if there's some realm of beauty in animal life.
No, I agree. That seems
Well, but so why should that be if the point is just reproduction?
yeah. So there's obviously some. Well, I think on one level, if you take the model of poetry, right, the beautiful poem or the attractive poem guarantees it a kind of endurance, right? And so the ladder of love, which I really take to be a ladder of beauties more than really of love, for the reasons we've already laid out. But the idea is, the closer you get to truth, right, the more the beauties you produce, right, true beauty, as she puts it, the closer you get, the more beautiful the thing you produce will be from various perspectives in time and place, as she puts it, right? So the more absolute, the more you're in touch with the true beauty, the more absolute the beauty is doing. Now, there's a problem there, because by her own account, reparticularizing the beautiful immediately makes it not absolutely beautiful, and absolute beauty is not accessible to all. So there's a fundamental tension here at the problem of her. But the idea, at least on the surface of the argument, is that people need to find whatever it is you're producing or reproducing beautiful in order to continue to honor it, praise it, and for it to have this simulacrum of immortality that she's sort of advancing as the goal of our love of the good. Does that make some sense? I'm not sure.
It totally makes sense, but in the poets and the lawgivers, she also describes them as having human beloveds.
Mhm.
Right? As if, and I think there's something crazy about the way it's suggested, but as if people would only write great poetry in order to impress a beloved or something like that. But so what I have in mind is, in each case, there's a devotion to a beautiful human being.
Yeah.
And you could even wonder if the lawgivers aren't rather, how would I say, not picky enough about the people they consider themselves worthy of devoting themselves to, whole communities of people.
So is your point that love of so I mean, the way the conversation was going before was questioning whether love of the good is erotic, and you have been pushing the line that, well, you're not even sure that love of the beautiful is in all cases erotic.
That's true, but what I'm really pushing toward is this thought that devotion to beauty makes people hope for personal immortality.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's another sign of it. Diotima teaches like a perfect sophist, and she says the best people are just out for honor. And that should be an appalling statement to a normal person. And you definitely focus on its sophistry. But then she says they do everything for the sake of immortal virtue and such a reputation. And so she drops something to a serious human being much more important in there than the reputation. Do you see what I'm getting at? And devotion to the sort of virtue she's talking about is never separable from devotion to the human beings, because these are social virtues, or virtues that help other humans.
Yeah, that seems right. That there's the love of honor stuff really is slippery throughout that whole passage.
Yeah.
Because when in human reproduction, you originally, the notion is that you honor yourself in your offspring. So you love the thing in your offspring that you see that reminds you of yourself, right? Which I guess would be a good case for making sure that whoever you devote yourself erotically to reproduce with, that you love them, right, for those principal qualities, so that the dilution is somehow not as problematic, right? But then the eros or the honor gets sort of slips away from the beloved, or the offspring, and it shifts onto yourself, where you want to be honored directly by others. And so the point I make there is that at that point, you're trying to be the offspring, in effect, right? The thing being honored, or you risk becoming the offspring. And that might have something to do with why virtue comes in there. Because as you know, right, it's a social good. And therefore it's going to have some kind of it's going to involve I should say the honor there is more broadly social or political, and therefore it's going to bring in virtue in oneself is going to be the question, right, rather than seeing oneself in another. Yeah,
I see.
So is this right then, that the paradigmatic case of Eros is Eros of the beautiful. The paradigmatic case of Eros of the beautiful is Eros for a beautiful body. And the reason that's the paradigmatic case is because it is the fullest expression of the desire for personal immortality, or to give the flip side, the fullest indication that one finds the goods of this world to be insufficient. Are those formulations good based on what we've just said?
sounds fair in a general sketch. That seems about right. Yeah, I mean, this is the concern with the desire for immortality, right? Is letting go of these particular goods. And I mean, David is only 9.5 weeks into fatherhood, but they actually get more sacrifices than sleep and sort of cradling are down the road. But the loss of time studying Plato is something you will begin to feel very palpably, though there are obviously concrete goods in having children. But certainly it requires reconsidering those goods at the very least.
And one thing Alex just implied, I want to underline, because I thought what Jeff said made sense, but someone hearing it for the first time could end up with a very reductive view that love is just about personal immortality. And that's, I don't think, something any of us are saying. There's a tremendous joy in being with another person in the right way, but there's a hope that comes with it.
Yeah, I would wonder whether it might be helpful to look even more carefully at this formulation of "I want the good for myself forever," because I find it sort of hard to know what I even mean by myself, and this isn't a merely theoretical concern, because whenever, like paternity is a good example of this. Like, people reason about, oh, do I want to become, a parent? And what they're really reasoning about is, whether they know it or not, is something like, do I want to become something really much different from what I am? And so this is, and I think lots of, even we can see at the beginning of the symposium, you hear people saying things like, well, I used to think this was good, but now I've completely changed, almost to be unrecognizable to myself. And so I wonder whether there isn't always a kind of, in one of your sections going back, I think it might have been, gosh, you mentioned this problem about a loss of self versus, let's try to find it. But in any case, it strikes me that in any radical situation, such as the ones that we're talking about now, you really would have to lose yourself in order to keep it, or it would be some new self or some unimagined self or something like that. I wonder if this is part of the thing about being that shows up also in the Aristophanes myth about sort of, what do we what are we, on the one hand, what are we even saying when we say we want the good for, I want the good for myself forever, because I don't know what myself means. Presumably if the good is good enough, it might change who I am, on the one hand. And, you know, on the other hand, I think it's worth mentioning that this is not a merely, as I said before, not a merely theoretical thing, and that lots of people undertake this all the time. Even a religious conversion, people are like, you know, I'm a new man.
Yeah, I mean, this is it's complicated, but this is in a way like finding yourself through love is such a sort of common experience, right? And you see it with these sort of lovers of Socrates that populate the dialogue, but most powerfully, obviously, the one we encounter directly, Apollodorus, right? Who loves Socrates so much that everybody else is awful, including himself, right? Way more transformative and defining than it is for any other character, I think. But you know, it's this.
Aristodemus too, of course.
Aristodemus too, Agathon, and
Alcibiades.
yeah. I think the big question is, what about Plato? Is he an erotic lover of Socrates? And I don't think you can go that far. I think it's something different is happening on that level. But in any case, to go back to the original thought, you know, you look at like the Republic and I keep going back to the Republic because I'm teaching a seminar on it right now, but you go to the moral education and it's clear that the sort of vision of the perfect guardian speaks to Glaucon, and it speaks to something of himself that was always there, but which, you know, as he says, the countless others, right, like Thrasymachus, who talk in deaf, could not speak to, and which therefore puts him ill at ease with the sort of cynicism that they purvey. In a way, Eros is remarkably powerful and important, and to go back to David's point, it comes with real joys, I think, when you find it, precisely because it speaks to such a deep part of yourself. But again, in speaking so deeply, I think there is this risk that you lose sort of the singularity of the experience, means that you risk losing a sight, I think, on the sort of finitude of human life and the sort of finitude of good experiences that one might have. Which is, I guess, just to go back to this comment about coldness, which I think you were sort of obliquely touching on again, Michael, that on one hand, it's hard to sort of, it's hard not to be sober about these things when you're reading the Symposium and you see the sort of mystical heights it goes to, right? If you're at all sort of cautious, you'll look at that. But on the other hand, you want to somehow maintain the charm amid this sobriety. And that's very hard to do, right? It can easily be lost and turn into a kind of bitterness, right? That you sometimes see in the dialogues.
Isn't it
I
also
did think.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I would just say also, isn't it at least possible that these things are, that such a vision, which is, you know, whatever, self-annihilating as well as sort of, I don't know, preserving or promoting of the real self in some radical way, isn't it actually possible that such a thing could happen? I mean, you wouldn't say that you knew for sure that it was impossible. You know, like there may be like an even deeper level of coldness where you have to be sort of agnostic about whether such a thing could happen or not.
Immortality, you mean?
All of it, yeah, the whole vision and everything. I mean, you know, like whenever there's transcendence, whatever happens on the other side of it is, with at best difficulty, translated into the terms of the whatever the pre-transcendent state. But it could very well be that, I mean, you know, people do change so radically on the basis of having some experience or some vision. I mean, this is the sort of thing that actually happens to real people. They just change so deeply that it's as if they are, in some sense, no longer the same person. I'm sure we all know people that are like that if we aren't those people ourselves. And, you know, maybe, you know, this could actually be something like this could really happen.
I mean, this is where I would put, I would sort of advance this point though about, there's the question of transcendence, and then there's the question of your sort of the things you reproduce or produce, transcending. And that, I think, is the explicit claim that Diotima is trying to defend. It might be that in understanding the truth of things to the degree that's possible, there is an immense satisfaction. I think the communication of those truths raises distinct obstacles. And I think one example of this that we can sort of appreciate, since we're 2,500 years after Plato, is the difficulty of teaching these works. I find myself more and more introducing my seminars on Plato with Thucydides to give political and sort of context, to show these passions on not to historicize it or to conventionalize it, but to sort of give a sense of what's happening that Plato's drawing on. To say nothing of just having to explain the references to the poems, the sort of names, all of these things being lost. And it seems to me that on some level, Plato, who probably more than anybody was able to speak to sort of the human or the truth of the human situation, or however you want to put it, and to the problems that sort of litter our lives, even his work is to some degree littered with particulars that get in the way of that universal, even as they elucidate it. Now, I think Plato has tactics for shoring himself up against these things, right? He can draw on the political without it being essential to understanding some of his works. And so but nevertheless, there are certain obstacles, I think, always involved in this work that one has to tease out, that have to do with the fact that whatever he's getting at that's real, nevertheless has to be reparticularized. And that I think is the fundamental or sort of insurmountable problem with Diotima's the thesis she's trying to defend, that you can create immortal images of virtue or something like that, right? There's always going to be, I think, a barrier, right? If it's going to find itself in a rather foreign time and place, as Plato does now.
It just reminded me of a detail and a very nice question you asked about what Codrus is doing in the list of legislators that gets mentioned. You point out that Diotima's speech through Socratic machinations involves references to all the previous speakers, but Codrus seems gratuitous. And this is one of these details that might be a barrier for a reader. You have to rush off and do some research. It seemed to me that it looked like Codrus was somebody who took over responsibility for the Athenian regime from Theseus and his descendants, right? And so it looks like not only is the difficulty of particularization that becomes harder and harder to sustain as time goes on, but also that there's a kind of competition between people who are erotic in the same way, where one can take over and commandeer the eternal regime of another. And so that seemed like just both a very good example of the difficulty in understanding Plato, but also of the difficulty in taking Diotima's claims seriously.
Yeah, it's sort of like Lincoln speaking of a new birth of freedom, right? Like he had a baby with Publius or something like that. There's something strange about that, or the way Deleuze actually has a comment about this, about he calls interpretation buggery, and producing monstrous offspring. It's something a Frenchman would say. But the Codrus bit, I don't know what to do with that exactly. I suspect, and this is sort of my suggestion in the book, that might be a relic of one of the lost speeches, that somebody was speaking not just about the laws as Pausanias does, but about law giving. Whether that's one of the unnamed speakers, or maybe it was in Aristodemus's speech and he excised it. We have no idea what happens with that. There's certain hypotheses I throw around, but that's my guess, is that somebody spoke about eros and law giving, but either it was Aristodemus or somebody else, and Aristodemus ignored it. And that raises an interesting question, which is, right? Either he's confused about Eros and law giving, and that's why he gets rid of his speech, or he's not interested in it, and so he ignores it. But that's one of the mysteries I just that I think about. I'll say this about Aristodemus. More and more as I tried to understand this dialogue, everything seemed to hinge on his motivations or his character. He seems to be one of the most perplexing figures in the whole dialogue, even though he's apparently negligible and people seem to treat him as negligible and sort of laughable. He strikes me as one of the most interesting characters or sort of minor characters in the book dialogue.
So I just want to make sure I understood. You're thinking the whole theme of law giving is some sort of hint at a missing speech?
I wonder about it. I'm not sure. But it, when you have these missing speeches and Socrates is responding to everyone and he doesn't know what's going to be missing later, it stands to reason that one would look out for elements in his speech that might have referred to lost speeches. And I wonder, now laws play an interesting role in Pausanias's speech. And there is this suggestion that he might be engaged in a kind of subtle act of re-law giving, and perhaps that's what it is. But I wonder whether that's a hint. It's I think maybe the only place I can find a sort of big piece of or like a moment in the speech that just doesn't seem to fit with what came before. And so that's just a question I have about the Symposium.
I see. You could make it fit more. So the initial claim about daimons, right, is that they're responsible for all of the alleged communication from gods to human beings, or all the communication of humans to gods. Right. And then with the lawgiving, that passage culminates with temples being built to the lawgivers. Right. And so it makes me suspect that this treatment of Eros has the theme of the psychological sources of religious belief in mind, which would make total sense if it's also supposed to be treating the hope for immortality.
It's interesting. I'll have to think about that. Yeah.
So
We have
Alex, your mention of the importance of Aristodemus makes me think that maybe trying just to characterize in a way that we all like what Socrates is up to at Agathon that night would be interesting. I did like very much the suggestion that he's on a comic poet hunting expedition.
Yeah.
Right, that maybe Agathon's going to turn out to be the human being that he needs, but it turns out not to be the case. He's going to meet Plato soon enough, you remark. Why he would permit Aristodemus to go on that expedition, and also why that expedition would have as maybe a side benefit or a side project the attempt to order the erotic inclinations of the other speakers, so that they're all oriented somehow toward philosophy. I'm not sure I see what the Socratic motive would be there. Why is he concerned with working on these other people in this way?
Well, so let me try to offer a couple thoughts on all those pieces and how they might fit together. Well, one, Aristodemus, who imitates Socrates in appearance, and then whom Socrates drops back, let's go in. One of the questions I had is perhaps, he gets there, he's ushered right in, right? Perhaps that's a sign for him of how much is Agathon interested in him. And then he obviously sees them trying to bring him in and Aristodemus protecting him. And so I wonder whether that was a sort of like a reconnaissance effort on his part. And I'll say this, the only two times we hear Socrates standing and not saying anything and falling silent is at the beginning of the Symposium and later when Alcibiades said he did it in war. So maybe it's a kind of tactic, right, in his sort of expedition here. And then when he gets in there, he starts teasing Agathon for his interest, right? Oh, the last seat just happens to be next to you. Like, what are you hoping for, right? It's clear what he's toying around with him there. Now, the symposium, right, it culminates in the speech where he's integrating all of these, saying you can all find satisfaction with him. But it's also primarily, I think, directed to Agathon. He's showing Agathon the sort of power of philosophy, that it can appeal to all these longings in a way that his can't, because what Socrates is able to do is make Agathon look like a fool at his own party. He gets all this praise, and Socrates quickly shows there's a huge problem in his speech. And then he shows how he can win sort of, or create a vision that brings everybody together on some level, while also promising him the wisdom of Socrates and the fame of Homer. That's effectively what the speech promises to Agathon. So I think it all does kind of integrate into this thing. Now, the Aristodemus being there, I think, indicates has a kind of bigger problem, which is that he gets the word out. And there's every reason to think that Socrates' speech becoming public might have something to do with this sense that he doesn't believe in the gods of the city. I mean, Eros is a minor god, but he is a god and he denies his divinity. And it could be shocking. And it's now gone outside of the circle of Socratics to these unnamed sort of moneymakers, right? Who, in just be called comrade, right, could be anyone, which is, I think, often how Plato uses this. Comrade means unidentified, unidentifiable, and therefore worrisome. It's gone outside of the named and the friendly, or at least the trusted or known to the unknown, and that's a problem. So I'm not sure how all these pieces should fit together, but it does suggest, at least on one level, the need for a kind of beautification of Socrates, or a sort of poetic representation of philosophy.
On this point, I would like to propose that it looks as if it's not just Plato who's doing that, but Socrates himself is doing this of himself. That is to say, super seductive. That's part of the, I really appreciate it. One of the main things I especially liked is about your book, Alex, was the way that you read that very thing that you just mentioned, namely the appearance of, the servants are all like, oh, there he is, grab him, because, and they think it's Socrates because they got the double, right? And thought that was really smart of you. I hadn't seen that before, but then I thought, well, there's a lot of seduction going on here, right? And so Socrates being like, oh no, send the double, oh, he's here, oh, he's not really here. And then like, oh, not really, he's here, but he's not really here. It's all very kind of Dance of the Seven Veils, we have, and then at the level of the text as well, we have all of these, kind of masks and sort of, now you see it, now you don't, and do you really have it, and slips away, and all this other stuff. It's extremely, and then all that, whatever seductive kind of flirty badinage that's going on between Socrates and everybody else. And then, Alcibiades again, he's saying, oh, he's got these hidden things, and who wouldn't want to know these hidden, penetrate into the hidden things. And so it looks to me as if it's not only Plato, but also Socrates, who are both conspiring together to make Socrates into an incredible, Eromenon. And this does lead me to wonder what we're supposed to, like, if Apollodorus and, the folks who mimic him in overt ways are ridiculous, what is the right way to be the lover of Socrates, if any? How are we supposed to, if we get this whole array of people that try to love him and look in one way or another ridiculous, or like they're getting it by the wrong handle, what do you suppose is the right handle, since clearly it's designed to be so seductive? So I would be delighted to know what your thoughts about that are.
Yeah, I mean, this is getting at the relationship, I think, between Socrates and Plato, which again, I hesitate to call love, but there is a kind of relationship there to Socrates. And I mean, the book starts with Apollodorus spilling all the beans, right? And Aristodemus, a bit more cautious, circling among apparently Socratics only, to Socrates at a private party sharing his thoughts with a sort of select few. But then we hear in Alcibiades' speech, he gets drunk and sort of spills the beans about a very intimate moment with Socrates underneath a blanket, if not underneath, also underneath his cloak, if not showing himself completely nude. I suspect he did, and he got, even Alcibiades couldn't go that far in his drunkenness. But the dialogue ends with an argument that Socrates is having just with Aristophanes and Agathon, and which Aristodemus, because he's not like Socrates, gets too drunk and passes out, and then wakes up and in his fog only captures like the thesis and not the argument being advanced to defend it, can't have, but which Plato obviously has, because if anybody sort of puts together tragedy and comedy, and does so really effectively in the Symposium, I think, where all these allusions to the death of Socrates, but all this sort of playful stuff, he declines to put it in writing. He keeps it as a secret. I think he makes intimations about what he means, but he keeps it as a secret between him and Socrates. And so he's not one of these lovers like Apollodorus, who never shuts up about his girlfriend, this kind of guy. But he's a sort of respectful lover. You could say he's just a friend with an inside joke and a sort of inside conversation, which he'll represent and offer some insight into, but which he's not so crass as to divulge. That kind of relationship, whatever it might be in the end, I think is if not an erotic love of Socrates, it is a proper relationship. At least it escapes many of the pitfalls of the others.
Well, in particular, do you think that there's an idea that we should or should not, when Apollodorus, when Socrates says to Apollodorus, hey, why don't you come to the party? Or is it Aristodemus? I can't remember. Says, why don't you come to the party? And he responds, oh, I'll do whatever you say. That's quite striking, and could be read in an erotic way or in various different ways. But it looks like, and then there's the mimicry of Socrates, etc. But sure seems like, I don't know, when I read Socrates, I kind of want to know what parts of this should I mimic. I mean, he is, well, and what Socrates says after this is, after he says, oh, I'll do whatever you say, Socrates says, follow me. And so I guess another way of putting the same question is to ask, what does follow me mean? Diotima also uses the word follow, but she says you might not be able to follow me. And so I'm sort of interested in what you think I hear, what counts as a good way of following Socrates, if any.
Yeah, Aristodemus is an interesting example because he's a kind of crude version of what is in a way a sort of a kind of acceptable way of relating to Socrates. He's not so sort of temperamental as Apollodorus. He wants to ape him, and so one thing I came to understand leading up to writing this book is that I tend to think of Aristodemus and Apollodorus as foils. One loves Socrates and therefore hates everyone else. The other, and so he seems to sort of embody this sort of, I love this transcendent thing that human beings can't approach, right? And so like a divinization of the beloved. Whereas Aristodemus appears, at least at first glance, to take, no, Socrates is a model, I'll follow him. But the problem is he can only follow these external characteristics. Now, from the side of creating a sort of poetized version of Socrates that can give him greater sort of currency or longer currency, he's incredibly helpful to think about, Aristodemus. And I think it's something that Plato certainly exploits. But in the end, I wonder whether he doesn't have the same motive as Apollodorus, or whether he's not also guilty of divinizing something and implicitly engaging in a kind of self-hatred. It's not as obvious, but he can't drink like Socrates, he can't stay up late, he can't think and argue like Socrates. And it might be that he gave a speech, right? But got rid of it. And that would be, if that possibility is true, and I don't know if we can decide it, but if that possibility is true, I think it would suggest that he has a kind of self-hatred. That's strictly speaking, not maybe healthy for himself, but perhaps a good understanding of how a poet might take advantage of these passions and give Socrates or philosophy a sort of a home, right? that Plato takes advantage of in making Socrates young and beautiful.
Well, I agree that it's easy to, like, I mean, I agree that these people are foils in the way that you said, but what the question for me is, okay, well, great, what's the right way? What's the good way? I mean, if Socrates is in any sense a teacher, then, if you follow a teacher, to use that word again, then you are in some way, whatever, abasing yourself, which in many cases is appropriate. Right. So this does get back to this question of like a radical personal transformation. But in any case, what's the right way of, admiring Socrates or loving Socrates? Is there any guidance? There seems to be lots of wrong ways to do it, but is there any guidance about the right way?
I mean, it would have to be something like Plato's respectful disagreements with Socrates, or friendly disagreements with Socrates about writing, about his death. Apparently, when at least the young Plato wanted to get him to avoid his death. What he ultimately thought about that is very, very difficult, but obviously the mode in which they conducted themselves philosophically differs in some way, whether that's by creature of circumstance. Socrates is dead now, something needs to be done to preserve him, and therefore writing has a legitimacy it didn't have before. The hero Socrates needs his poet. I think there's tons of allusions to this, right? And the need to create an enduring sort of model of it. There are all these, after Socrates' death, there are all these Socratic groups popping up at the beginning of the Parmenides, the Theaetetus, the Phaedo. They're unwilling distortions of Socrates, or unconscious, and so maybe Plato thought he had to preserve that. But that would be something like the model. I don't know the answer to these questions, but I think you'd have to start working on that issue of Plato versus Socrates, if it's ultimately a versus, or on what level it is a sort of opposition.
It also seemed to me that you had an interestingly nuanced account of Alcibiades' character, and in particular one that doesn't accept that Alcibiades is a failed educational experiment on Socrates' part, or not simply a failure. One of the things you mentioned is in Alcibiades' speech, he says he doesn't want to grow old sitting beside Socrates. And I wondered whether there wasn't something appropriate about that. Maybe Xenophon would be another example of a human being who didn't want to grow old sitting beside Socrates. And you make a cryptic reference to the Cleitophon at one point, right, which is this unanswered criticism of Socrates that basically alleges that Socrates knows how to make you aware of your neediness, but not how to help you satisfy it. Mm-hmm. Right? That also would suggest that association with Socrates, the correct association, is somehow transitional, right? He puts you on, he makes you aware of the need to attend to your own concern for the good, but then that's up to you subsequently.
Yeah, I mean, your mention of Xenophon is appropriate. I found myself while working on this book wanting more and more to read Xenophon, and I was of course just thinking about the memorabilia, but above all, I was filled with erotic longing for the Anabasis, and I'll just do a plug for your very interesting episodes on the Anabasis, right, for combat and classics. I mean, but that was definitely, it's risen up on my my list of things I need urgently to think about for that very reason. Yeah, that there's this sort of appreciation and decision to live a different kind of life than what Socrates suggests, and wanting to understand Xenophon's grounds for that decision and whether he was ultimately happy with that decision. I mean, that's a fascinating question, and you're absolutely right to raise it. Lewis is back. That means the fun's over.
I'm back. All good things must come to an end, we're told. Really, this has been an outstanding conversation. I want to thank all the participants tonight: Alex, Jeff, David, and Michael. It's really been great. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in live, and everyone who watches this in the coming days. It'll be on Facebook on Political Animal Press's account there and on YouTube on our account there. It'll show up there within the next day or two. Everyone should read Musings on Plato's Symposium, and our thanks again to Alex for writing it. And I think Alex, do you want to say anything by way of signing out?
Yeah, I mean, thanks to all of you for reading it. I mean, like I said, what you really want are thoughtful readers. And as I was given some of the questions ahead of time and listening to the questions here, this is exactly the sort of thing I was hopeful for, and can't ask for better interlocutors. So thank you. I'm really appreciative of your time, and Louis, of course, to yours as well, and for publishing it and for your guidance. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks to everyone, and good night to all.
Thank you. And Alex, a lot in your book was new to me and helpful.
Thank you.
Ditto.
Yeah, well done.
Thanks.
Good night.